The young woman stood perfectly still in the narrow, dark space just off the stage, a place they called the wing. It was more like a waiting room for ghosts, she thought. The grand red velvet curtain beside her hid the world, but it couldn't silence it. The low, steady rumble of hundreds of voices from the audience seeped through the heavy fabric, a sound like distant traffic, or maybe like a river she was about to drown in. Her name didn't matter in that moment. She was just a collection of raw, trembling nerves stuffed into a dress that felt all wrong. The gown was a deep, midnight blue silk, something her mother had helped her pick. "It makes you look like a professional," her mother had said, her eyes shining with pride. Now it just felt tight across her shoulders, a slippery second skin that she was sure would betray her with a rustle at the worst possible moment. She had practiced in old t-shirts and sweatpants. This fabric felt like a costume for someone braver. She tried to take a deep breath, the way her teacher had taught her. Breathe into your belly, not your chest. But her lungs seemed to have forgotten how to work. Each breath was a short, shallow gasp that caught in her throat. The air back here was warm and smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint, oily scent of the stage lights. She could hear the rustling of the orchestra members on the other side of the curtain, the soft thump of a bass being moved, the clear, piercing note of a violin being tuned. Every sound was a tiny hammer tap on her already tight nerves. This was it. The Civic Symphony Hall, the biggest stage in the city. For years, it had been a picture on her bedroom wall, a goal so distant it felt like a dream of someone else's life. Countless hours had led here. Hours spent in a small, stuffy practice room at the conservatory, the walls marked with pencil notes and old tape. Hours where her fingers ached and her back cramped, repeating difficult passages until they were perfect, and repeating them again until they were effortless. Hours of missing parties, of eating dinner late over sheet music, of falling asleep with melodies looping in her head. It had all been for this one night, this 20-minute piece. And now, the mountain of work behind her felt like nothing compared to the cliff in front of her. Her mind, which should have been calmly reviewing the opening bars of the Rachmaninoff, was instead a frantic, chattering mess. Asterisk, what if I forget? What if my hands freeze? What if I walk out and trip? The sheet music for the concerto, which she knew so well she could see every note and marking in her sleep, had dissolved into a blurry, black and white mess in her memory. She tried to picture the first page, but the staves wobbled, the notes swam. Her stomach clenched, a hard, cold knot of pure fear. She looked down at her hands. They were her tools, her voice. They were resting limply at her sides, looking pale and strange against the dark silk of the dress. She willed them to stop shaking, but a fine, constant tremor vibrated through them. These were the same hands that had confidently flown across the keyboard in the empty hall just this afternoon during the dress rehearsal. Where had that confidence gone? It had leaked out of her, she thought, with every minute that ticked closer to the performance. From her spot in the shadows, she could see a sliver of the stage. The brilliant, white-hot glow of the main lights spilled across the polished wooden floor. She could see the conductor's polished black shoes and the hem of his tails as he acknowledged the audience's welcoming applause. Her piano was out there, waiting. A vast, beautiful beast of polished ebony, its lid propped open like a giant silent wing. In the practice room, her piano was a friend, scuffed and familiar. This one looked like a judge. A stagehand, dressed in black, gave her a quick, sympathetic smile and a thumbs up. She tried to smile back, but her face felt like it was made of plaster. Her heart was no longer just beating fast. It was throwing itself against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. The sounds of the audience were tuning down. The concertmaster had finished tuning the orchestra. The rustling was settling into an expectant hush. This was the quiet before the storm, and she was standing right in its path, Her teacher's last words echoed in her head. You have done the work. The music is in your bones now. Just let it out. It sounded so simple, but her bones felt like jelly. Her teacher wasn't here, back in this dark, scary wing. She was alone. The conductor, a tall man with kind eyes she'd come to respect deeply over weeks of rehearsal, turned his head slightly. He wasn't looking directly at her, but past the curtain's edge, into the darkness where she stood. It was time. His slight nod wasn't just an instruction. It felt like a final gentle push off a very high diving board. For a second, her feet refused to move. They were rooted to the dusty floorboards. The urge to turn and run, to flee back down the narrow, dim corridor to the dressing room, was so powerful it made her dizzy. She could picture it, pushing past the stagehand, tearing through the hallways, out the stage door, and into the cool, anonymous night air, freedom. But she thought of her parents sitting out there in the 5th row. She could almost feel the heat of her mother's hopeful gaze. She thought of her grandmother, who had saved money for years to buy her first real piano. She thought of her roommate, who had put up with her obsessive practicing without a single complaint. If she ran now, she wouldn't just be failing herself. She'd be failing all of them. So she forced one foot forward, then the other. The movement felt clumsy, as if she'd forgotten how to walk. She pushed past the heavy, scratchy weight of the velvet curtain and stepped into the light. It was instant and overwhelming. The stage lights were a physical force, hot and blinding. They washed out all the details of the vast hall, turning the first dozen rows of the audience into a dark, shapeless mass. Beyond that, nothing but blackness. But she could feel them. Every single person. 1,000 pairs of eyes, all focused on her. The young woman in the blue dress, walking slowly, too slowly, toward the piano. The applause started then, polite and welcoming. It sounded like rain on a distant roof. It was for her, but it didn't feel real. Her ears were buzzing. Her vision tunneled until all she could see was the bench and the endless, terrifying stretch of the keyboard. The walk across the stage felt like the longest journey of her life. She was sure everyone could see her legs shaking. She was sure the click of her heels on the stage was too loud, a stupid, clumsy sound. Finally, she reached it. The piano loomed even larger up close. She placed a hand on its cool, glossy side for balance, or maybe just to make sure it was real. Then she turned to the dark sea of the audience, managed a stiff, small bow from the waist, and quickly turned away. She couldn't look at them for another second. She settled onto the bench. The leather was smooth and cool. She adjusted it slightly, a mechanical gesture she'd done 1,000 times. She placed her shaking hands in her lap, curling her fingers into her palms, hiding them. She stared at the keys. They were a landscape of white and black, a path she had to travel. But right now, it looked like a minefield. The conductor raised his baton. The orchestra sat poised, instruments ready. The hall was utterly, profoundly silent. A silence so heavy it pressed against her eardrums. This was it. The moment between breaths. The point of no return. All the work, all the fear, all the hope, it all funneled down to this single impossible point. Her mind was a blank white screen. Her heart was a frantic drum. Her body was a statue of terror. She lifted her trembling hands from her lap and held them suspended over the keys. The keys were a vast, silent expanse beneath her hovering hands. They were no longer just a tool or a challenge. In that searing white silence, they looked alien. The polished ebony of the sharps and flats was like a dark, complicated river cutting through the fields of creamy ivory. It was a map to a country she had forgotten how to navigate. Her mind scrabbled for the first note, the first chord, the first movement of muscle memory. But there was nothing. Just static, a blank, White panic dot, she lowered her hands into her lap again, a silent admission of defeat before she'd even begun. The heat of the lights was like a physical weight on the back of her neck. She could feel the impatient stillness of the orchestra behind her, the held breath of the audience in front. The conductor's baton was still raised, a tiny suspended threat. Time stretched, rubbery, and strange. A second felt like an hour. She looked down, not at her hands, but through them. The blue silk of her dress pooled in her lap, and for some reason her eyes focused on a tiny, almost invisible snag in the fabric, a little pull of a thread. It was so ordinary, so out of place here in this temple of high art, and that ordinary little flaw was a crack in the damn dot. It didn't bring back the music. Instead, it brought back a smell, not the smell of dust and hot lights and floor polish, but the smell of old wood and lemon oil, and the faint, sweet scent of ginger biscuits that always seemed to linger in the air of her grandmother's front room. The memory didn't come as a thought, but as a feeling, a sudden, total sense of being somewhere else. She was 10 years old. The piano in front of her wasn't this colossal, gleaming monster. It was her grandmother's upright, a warm brown thing that stood in a patch of afternoon sunlight by the big window. Its surface was scratched and dotted with little rings from countless cups of tea. The keys were not a perfect ivory. They were yellowed with age, and a few near the middle had tiny chips missing from the corners, like little smiles. The middle C key had a faint gray smudge that never quite washed off, from where her sticky child fingers had always found their starting point. She had been struggling that day, too. A simple piece by Mozart, just a few lines, but her small hands felt clumsy. She kept hitting a wrong note in the same measure, a jarring, ugly sound that made her flinch. Frustration built behind her eyes, hot and sharp. She wanted to slam the key lid down and run outside. Then, a presence. Her grandmother didn't say a word. She just pulled up her own worn, padded stool and sat close, her soft floral perfume mixing with the smell of the room. She didn't look at the music. She looked at the girl's hands, now lying uselessly in her own lap, just as they were now on the concert stage. "You are trying to play it out there," her grandmother said, her voice a soft, crackly sound like paper. She gestured vaguely toward the empty air in front of the piano. "You are throwing your music at the keys and hoping it sticks." The young girl on the memory stool sniffed, not understanding. "Where else is it?" Her grandmother smiled. She reached over and took the child's right hand, not roughly, but with a gentle firmness. She turned it over, palm up, and tapped a finger lightly on the center of her small wrist, where the bones and tendons met. "It is in here," she said. Then she moved her finger to tap the girl's chest, right over her heart. "And in here, the music is already sleeping inside you. The piano." She turned the child's hand back over and placed her fingertips gently on the cool, chipped keys. "The piano is just the door. You do not force the door. You turn the handle and you let the music walk through." Back on the stage, a small, almost imperceptible breath escaped the young woman's lips. It wasn't a practiced breath from her lessons. It was just a sigh, a release of the tightest band of fear around her chest. Her grandmother's words, forgotten for years, were now as clear as if she had just spoken them into the silent, waiting hall. "The piano is just the door." She looked at the intimidating keyboard again. She didn't try to see the sheet music. She didn't try to remember the fingering. Instead, she thought of the sound she wanted. Not the sound the critics wanted, or the conductor expected, or her parents hoped for. She thought of the sound she had felt the first time she'd truly listened to this piece, alone in her dorm room with cheap headphones. It wasn't about technique then. It was about a deep, aching longing that rose and fell, a story of sorrow that slowly, stubbornly, turned into strength. It had made her cry, not from sadness, but from recognition. As if the composer, decades ago, had written down a feeling she herself had carried but never named. That was the music sleeping in her bones. That was what she had to let out. Her grandmother had shown her something else that day. After the talk of doors and sleeping music, she had said, "Forget the little black dots on the page for a minute. Listen." And her grandmother, whose own hands were knotted with arthritis, had placed her twisted fingers on the keys. She hadn't played the Mozart. She had played 3 slow, simple chords. They weren't fancy. They were just solid, rooted, a deep, warm, comforting sound that filled the sunlit room. "That is home base," her grandmother said. "No matter how far the music travels, how scared it gets, it can always come back to this sound. Find your home base on the piano. Then you are never lost." On the stage, the young woman's hands, still in her lap, uncurled. A fine tremor was still there, but it was different now. It was less like fear and more like energy, a current waiting to be grounded. She knew what her home base was for this piece. It wasn't the first, crashing chord of the concerto. That was the journey's start. The home base was the deep, resonant note that lived underneath the entire first movement, the bedrock upon which all the emotion was built. It was a low C, the heart of the piano. She didn't think about the audience anymore. She didn't think about the conductor, whose baton she knew must still be held aloft, though she couldn't see him. The blinding lights became just a warmth, like the afternoon sun in her grandmother's front room. Slowly, with a deliberate calm that felt entirely new, she raised her hands again. This time she didn't hold them suspended in the terrifying space above the keys. She moved her right hand, just a small, sure movement, and placed her thumb on that low C, not to play it yet, just to feel it. The cool, smooth solidity of the key under her skin was an electric connection. It was real. It was just a piece of wood and ivory, like her grandmother's chipped keys. It was just a door, and she was finally ready to turn the handle. She drew in a deep, true breath, one that filled her belly the way her teacher had always wanted. She felt her shoulders drop, her spine lengthen. She settled into the bench, not perching on it anymore, but belonging to it. Her left hand came up and found its position. Her gaze softened, looking at the keyboard not as a foe to be conquered, but as a landscape she was about to walk through, starting from a place she knew. A place called home. The frantic drumbeat of her heart was still there, but it had changed its rhythm. It was no longer a panic. It was a pulse. A count-off. The anticipation before a story begins. She gave the smallest of nods, not to the conductor, but to herself. To the memory of a sunlit room, of ginger biscuits, of a gentle voice saying, "Asterisk, let the music walk through." Asterisk, her thumb pressed down. The key traveled downward under the gentle, firm pressure of her thumb. It wasn't a strike. It wasn't an attack. It was a descent, deep and purposeful. There was a moment of resistance, the subtle, familiar click of the mechanism inside the grand piano engaging, and then the hammer fell. The sound was not what she expected. In the tense, silent hall, she had braced for a single lonely note to ring out. A tiny pebble dropped into a vast, dark well. But that's not what happened. The low C vibrated through the great body of the instrument, a dark, rich, velvet tone. It didn't just hang in the air. It bloomed. It grew, spreading out from the piano and filling the space around her. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was an immensely present one. It had weight and body. She felt it travel up her arm, through her wrist, her elbow, and into the very core of her chest. It was a physical sensation, a deep resonance that hummed in her bones, just as her grandmother had said it would. That vibration was a signal. It was a switch thrown in a dark room. The paralyzing fear that had frozen her mind didn't melt away in a dramatic rush. It was simply bypassed. Her conscious mind, the part that had been chattering about failure and judgment, went quiet. It was as if the direct connection from her ear to her heart, to her hands had been suddenly restored, and all the noisy static in between was cut off. Her left hand moved next, not because she told it to, but because it knew. It laid down a series of chords, the foundational architecture of the piece. They were slow, deliberate, and achingly beautiful. Each one built upon the first, like stones carefully placed. The music was no longer something out there that she had to chase and capture. It was a path unfolding right under her fingertips, and she was walking it, step by solid step. Then her right hand joined, weaving a simple, sorrowful melody above the deep foundation. The opening of Rachmaninoff's concerto is not a showy burst of fireworks. It is a lament, a solitary voice singing of something lost. And that's exactly what it became. She wasn't performing Rachmaninoff's sadness anymore. She was channeling her own. The anxiety of the last hour, the years of pressure, the weight of expectation, it all found a shape in those mournful, rising notes. The music gave her fear a language, and in speaking it, the fear lost its power. It was transformed. It became part of the story, a bittersweet color in the sound. Her eyes lost their fixed, glassy stare. They softened, following the movements of her hands, not with worry, but with a kind of quiet recognition. Asterisk, oh yes. There you are. Asterisk, she saw her own fingers, pale against the dark wood, and they were no longer trembling strangers. They were her own familiar hands again, doing the work they had been trained for, but now with a feeling behind the action that had been missing in the practice room dot. She became aware of the orchestra, but in a new way. Before, they had been a jury, a crowd of watchers. Now she heard them breathe with her. As she finished the piano's lonely introduction, she sensed, rather than saw, the conductor's baton sweep down. The strings entered, a soft, sighing cloud of sound that wrapped around her melody like a mist. It wasn't a competition. It was a conversation. Her piano line spoke, and the orchestra answered, supporting, agreeing, deepening the emotion. A tiny, almost invisible smile touched the corner of her mouth. It wasn't for the audience. It was for the sheer, shocking relief of it. The music was working. It was alive, and she was a part of it, not its master, but its vessel. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up near her ears with tension, relaxed. She sat taller. The physical act of playing became effortless. The difficult leaps and runs that had taken months to master flowed without a single conscious thought. Her muscle memory, built from thousands of hours of repetition, was finally free to operate on its own, guided now by emotion instead of fear. She stole a glance, just the briefest flick of her eyes, toward the conductor. He was no longer a stern figure waiting for her to begin. His face was alight with concentration, his whole body moving with the swell of the music. He caught her eye for a fraction of a second, and in that instant she saw it. Not approval, not judgment, but shared joy. The pure, simple joy of making the thing they had rehearsed come alive. He gave a slight, encouraging tilt of his head, and she looked back to her hands. A warmth spreading through her dot, the piece began to build. The sorrowful melody started to stir, to fight against its own sadness. Her fingers grew more assertive, the chords from her left hand stronger, more insistent. The orchestra swelled in response. The sound in the hall became huge, a wave gathering itself. She could feel it in the floor, in the air. She pressed the keys, and the piano pushed back, a living, resonant force. She wasn't thinking about the next note or the next page. She was riding the current of the music she was creating. She was deep inside the story now. The bright, lonely longing of the opening was giving way to something else, a determined strength. A passionate argument against despair. As the music climbed toward its first powerful climax, a memory flashed, bright and clear. It was from a particularly grueling practice session last winter. It was dark by 4 o'clock, and she was alone in a cold practice room, struggling with this very section. She'd played it wrong again and again, her fingers stiff and angry. In frustration, she had stopped, put her head down on the cool wood of the piano, and cried tears of pure exhaustion. She had whispered to the empty room, "I can't do this." But after the tears were spent, she had sat up, wiped her face, and played it again. And again. And on the 10th try, it had clicked. Not perfectly, but correctly. And for a moment, she had felt a spark of it, the feeling, the power the music was supposed to have. It had only lasted a second, but she had caught a glimpse. Now, on the stage, that spark was a bonfire. The struggle of that winter afternoon, and 100 afternoons like it, was the fuel. Every hour of doubt, every moment of wanting to quit, had been poured into this. It hadn't been wasted. It had all been compost, and now it was feeding this magnificent, roaring sound. Her fingers flew, sure and strong, across a cascading run of notes, a shower of sound that led the whole orchestra up to the peak. Her body moved with the force of it, a natural, unplanned rocking motion. She was no longer a statue. She was a musician, utterly lost in, and completely found by, the music. She reached the summit, and for a single suspended chord, the entire world was that brilliant, triumphant, complex sound. And in that moment, she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any thought, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The door was open, and everything inside her was finally walking through. The peak of the music hung in the air, for a breathtaking second, a glorious shimmering crown of sound. Then, with a deep breath from the entire orchestra, it began its descent. The melody that returned in the piano was different now. The lonely, aching theme from the beginning came back, but it was changed. It was richer, wiser, carrying the memory of the struggle it had just been through. It wasn't just sad anymore. It was resilient. She played this return with a tenderness that surprised even her. Her touch on the keys was lighter, a caress rather than a statement. She listened to the sound as it left the piano, not just as a producer of noise, but as a partner in a conversation. The violin section answered her, their bows moving as one, their sound a soft, empathetic echo. For the first time, she truly heard them. She heard the subtle breath of the flutes, the gentle pulse of the cellos. They weren't just accompaniment. They were the landscape through which her piano was traveling. She was telling the story, and they were painting the world around it. This was the heart of the piece. The fireworks of the climax were over, and now came the real work, the feeling. The notes on the page were just instructions. What happened between them, in the tiny spaces, in the slight delays and pushes of rhythm, in the whispering softness or the ringing strength of a single note, that was where the music lived. That was where she lived now. Her mind was perfectly clear, but it wasn't thinking in words. It was thinking in shapes and colors and emotions. The music was a river, and she was floating on it, aware of every current, every eddy. She made tiny decisions in real time, not because she planned to, but because they felt right. She leaned into a harmony, letting it ring a fraction longer, savoring the bittersweet clash of the chords before resolving it. She pulled back ever so slightly on a run of notes, making it sound like a wistful sigh instead of a technical display. She was no longer separate from the instrument. The line between her fingertips and the hammers, between her intention and the sound, had vanished. When she wanted a passage to sound like a desperate question, her hands seemed to know exactly how to shape the phrase to make it so. When the music called for a sudden burst of defiant hope, her whole body moved into the keys, drawing out a sound that was bright and bold, She glanced at the conductor again. Their connection was now effortless, a silent dialogue of nods and glances. He was following her, supporting her, his gestures inviting the orchestra to wrap themselves around her phrasing. It was a dance, and they were all moving together. The anxiety that had once made her see him as a judge was laughable now. He was her guide, helping her navigate this vast, beautiful world they were building moment by moment. A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot stage lights. It was the warmth of belonging. This orchestra, these serious-looking professionals with their expensive instruments, they weren't a wall she had to scale. They were a community she was part of just for tonight. The sound they made together was a physical thing in the hall, a shared creation that was more than any of them could make alone. The music moved into a quieter, more reflective section. Her part became sparse, single notes spaced out like stars in a dark sky. In these spaces, the silence became a part of the music itself. She could feel the audience in that silence. They weren't a terrifying mass anymore. They were just listening, really listening. She could feel their collective focus, a quiet energy that filled the hall. They were holding their breath with her. They were on the journey, two-dot in one of these quiet moments, as she played a simple, descending line of notes that sounded like falling tears. A clear, unbidden image came to her. It was of her father's hands. He was a quiet man, a carpenter. He had never really understood her music, but he had always supported it. She saw his hands, rough and strong, with scars and calluses from years of work. She saw them carefully sanding the legs of her first little piano bench in his workshop, making sure there were no splinters. He couldn't tell a concerto from a sonata, but he had built her a foundation, literally and figuratively. That memory of his silent, practical love poured into the next phrase she played, giving it a profound, gentle strength she hadn't planned out. This was the alchemy. Every memory, every feeling, every ounce of her life was being filtered through the music. The stage fright, the love for her grandmother, the support of her parents, the exhaustion, the doubt, the stubborn hope, it was all fuel. The piano was the furnace, and the beautiful, pouring sound was the light it gave off. The piece began to build again, gathering itself for its final great statement. This was different from the first climb. That had been a discovery of power. This was a declaration. She knew what was coming, and so did the orchestra. The energy between them tightened, coiling like a spring. The conductor's movements became bigger, more urgent, that her fingers found a new kind of certainty. It wasn't the rigid certainty of practice, but the flexible, powerful certainty of conviction. She knew what she wanted to say. As the tempo increased, the notes tumbled over one another, a torrent of passion. She and the orchestra were no longer just cooperating. They were driving each other forward, faster, higher, louder. The brass section stood, their golden instruments flashing in the light, adding a brilliant, blazing edge to the sound. The timpani rolled like thunder. She was at the very center of the storm, and she was absolutely calm within it. Her hands were a blur, but her mind was serene. Every note landed true. The physical effort was immense. She could feel the muscles in her back and shoulders working, a fine sweat on her brow, but it was a joyful effort. It was the final, thrilling push at the end of a long, hard race. She took a huge breath, her body bracing for the final, crashing chords. She looked at the conductor, their eyes locked. His baton swept up, and then plunged down dot with all the strength and emotion of the last 20 minutes concentrated into a single motion. She brought her hands down onto the keys. The sound was monumental. It wasn't just noise. It was a conclusion, a resolution. Every conflict in the music, every question, found its answer in those ringing, triumphant chords. The orchestra joined in one last, glorious shout of sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the hall. And then silence, a different silence. A full, pregnant, complete silence. The storm was over. Her hands fell from the keys, resting lightly in her lap. She was breathing hard, her heart pounding, but it was the steady, strong pound of an athlete after a peak performance. The last echo of the final note faded into the air. She had done it. She hadn't just played the notes. She had told the story. She had let the music walk through, and in doing so, she had walked through a door herself, leaving a trembling girl in a blue dress in the wings, and finding a musician here, on the bench, in the beautiful and echoing quiet. The silence after the final chord was absolute. It was a thick, tangible thing in the hall, a held breath shared by 1,000 people. For a moment, the young woman on the bench simply existed within it. She could hear the faint, ringing echo in her own ears, the ghost of the sound clinging to the air. Her hands, now still and quiet in her lap, felt warm and alive, still humming with the memory of the keys. Then the silence broke. It started as a single, sharp clap from somewhere in the dark void of the audience. Then another. And then it wasn't just clapping. It was a wave, a crashing, roaring wave of sound that rushed toward the stage. It wasn't the polite, expected applause from the beginning. This was different. It was loud, emotional, and alive. It had weight and heat. The sound jolted her back into her body. She had been so far inside the music that the outside world had ceased to exist. Now it came rushing back in the blinding lights, the smell of the stage, the vast, dark shape of the hall. She blinked, taking a slow, shaky breath. The reality of where she was, and what she had just done, settled over her. Slowly, she turned on the bench to face the audience. The sea of darkness was now a moving, rumbling landscape of shadows and flashes, the pale ovals of faces, the glint of eyeglasses, the movement of hands coming together and again. She saw people rising to their feet in the front rows, then more rows behind them. Like a wave moving backward, the entire hall was standing up. A standing ovation. A flush of heat spread from her chest up to her cheeks. This wasn't just success. It was something deeper, more overwhelming. It was a connection. They weren't just applauding because the concert was over. They were applauding because they had felt it, too. The story she told had reached them. The conductor, beaming, turned from the orchestra and gestured grandly toward her, inviting her to take a bow of her own. She stood up. Her legs felt strange, like they were made of something both heavy and weightless. She took a step forward, the simple movement feeling monumental. She gave a small, formal bow from the waist, her hair falling forward to brush her cheeks. The applause swelled even louder. It was a sound that seemed to press against her skin. When she straightened up, she found herself looking not at a faceless crowd, but at individual people. In the second row, she saw a woman dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. A few rows back, a man had his hand over his heart. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, was staring at her with wide, awestruck eyes, clinging to her program. This was the real victory. Not the notes played correctly, but the feeling shared. The conductor shook the concertmaster's hand and then walked over to her, his hand outstretched. She took it. His grip was firm, warm. He leaned in close so she could hear him over the roar. That, he said, his eyes shining, was not a performance. That was a gift. Thank you. He then gently guided her to turn and acknowledge the orchestra. She turned and faced the musicians. They were all on their feet too, tapping their bows, tapping their feet, smiling at her. The cellists raised their bows in a salute. The stern-looking principal violinist, who had intimidated her in rehearsals, gave her a firm, approving nod. These were professionals, veterans of hundreds of concerts, and they were applauding her. The warmth in her chest grew, tight and sweet. She bowed to them deeply, a gesture of true gratitude. They had been her partners, her safety net, her fellow travelers. Without them, the journey would have been impossible. After several more bows, the conductor led her off the stage. The moment she stepped into the dark wing, the sound of the applause became muffled, but she could still feel its vibration through the floor. The stagehand who had given her the thumbs up earlier was now grinning from ear to ear. Incredible, he mouthed, giving her 2 thumbs up this time. She walked down the narrow, dim corridor toward the dressing rooms. The air felt cooler back here. Her body was beginning to process the enormity of the last half hour. A slight tremor returned to her hands, but it wasn't anxiety. It was the aftershock of immense effort, like the tremble in a runner's legs after a race. She pushed open the door to her small, private dressing room. It was quiet. The blue dress suddenly felt like a costume again, but a proud one. She sat down heavily in front of the mirror, the bright bulbs framing her reflection. She looked different. Her eyes were bright, almost startled. There was a color in her cheeks. She looked older, not in a tired way, but in a settled way. Alone in the quiet, the first clear thought formed in words. I did it, but it was followed immediately by another, softer thought. We did it, her grandmother, her parents, her teacher, the conductor, the orchestra. All of them were in that sound. There was a soft knock on the door. Before she could answer, her parents slipped in. Her mother's eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with tears, but she was smiling a wobbly, radiant smile. She didn't say a word. She just rushed over and pulled her daughter into a tight, fierce hug that smelled of familiar perfume. Over her mother's shoulder, she saw her father. He wasn't a man for big speeches or tears. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, and just looked at her. He gave a single, slow nod. It was the same nod he gave when he finished a piece of furniture, and it was just right. It was the highest praise she could imagine from him. Friends and well-wishers began to stream into the crowded room. Orchestra members, the conductor again, people from the conservatory. The air filled with congratulations, with laughter, with the popping of a cork from a small bottle of champagne someone had brought. She smiled, she thanked people, she accepted hugs. But inside, she felt a strange, quiet center amidst the celebration. Later, much later, when the hall was dark and empty, and the last of the crowd had gone home, she found herself standing alone at the edge of the stage. She had changed back into her ordinary clothes jeans and a soft sweater. The grand piano stood closed now, a silent, sleeping beast in the gloom. A single work light cast long, dramatic shadows. She walked over to it and placed a hand on its cool, polished lid. She remembered the terror she had felt looking at it just a few hours before. Now, she felt only a deep, grateful kinship. She thought of her grandmother's old upright, with its chipped keys and the smell of ginger biscuits. She thought of the little girl who had struggled with Mozart in a patch of sunlight. That girl had been so far away on this big, scary stage tonight. But she had also been closer than anyone. The young woman leaned forward and did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She pressed her lips lightly to the smooth wood of the piano. It wasn't a kiss for the instrument itself, but for the memory it had carried, for the door it had opened. Thank you, she whispered into the quiet. Dark hall. Then she turned and walked off the stage, her footsteps echoing softly. The performance was over, but the music wasn't gone. It was still there, sleeping in her bones, waiting for the next door, the next key, the next silent moment before the beginning. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the silence. She knew what it held. It held everything.